Alrighty.
All right. Well, we're going to get started. Uh, we don't know who else will show up. Other people might still be doing their nails and will join us later. Um, Today, we have the South Dakota Poet Laureate and a very good friend of mine. I consider her one of my closer friends. Uh, on the same wavelength on a lot of things, but I like the way she handles not only poetry but her position as a state poet laureate. And we serve on a board together at the South Dakota State Poetry Society's board of directors. And so we've had a rather lengthy collaboration together. But today I want to kind of introduce her to all the rest of you who are on this Zoom conference, because I think she has some interesting things to share with us about poetry. So, with that, I will introduce Christine Stewart. And Christine, can you start off by giving us like a little bit of your background? Where were you born, grew up, that kind of thing?
Sure. And thanks for having me on today, and thanks for Lawrence for organizing this great series of conversations. I was born in Des Moines, Iowa, in the 1970s, and I grew up there. I lived in the same house. My parents still live there when I went to college. They only moved a few years after I left for college into another house that they still live in. So we're kind of a rooted type of people, I suppose, in my family. I went to Northern Iowa as an undergrad, which is in Cedar Falls, and I studied English education there and got really fired up about writing, even more so there than I had in high school growing up. A lot of teachers commented on my love of writing and my emergent skills in writing. One of my teachers accused me of plagiarizing a poem, and I felt like, hey, that was nice, that was good, because I knew I didn't plagiarize it, so it must have been that meant it was good. And I convinced, and like, he believed me once I defended myself. But yeah, so I went, and then I went on with my adult life. I went to Turkey to live for a couple of years. I taught at Tarsus American College in Tarsus. I went back to the States for my master's at Arizona State. Stayed in Arizona for a couple of years and taught more high school at different kinds of schools, actually. And then I got my PhD at the University of Nebraska, Lincoln. And then after that, I landed here in Brookings at SDSU, and I've been here ever since then. I don't know if that was the kind of
No, that's
background you wanted.
no, that's perfect. That gives us a kind of a round view and a framework in which we can understand the things that we hope to hear from you today.
Yep.
So, I'd like to start with your adventures in poetry. You know, what got you into poetry? What do you think are some of the, let's say, the catalysts for your interest in poetry?
So I've been writing poetry, I think, as assignments and things like that. The earliest artifact I have of poetry is a book that I made in third grade, and we made it, we marbled the front, and we like bound the pages, and I wrote some poems about butterflies and bugs, and I illustrated it with rainbows. And I also put the Pepsi challenge in there because like that dates it a little bit. Like I made my family take the Pepsi challenge, and I kept track. So there's a little bit of pop culture graphs going on in the middle of the book. That's my earliest artifact of it. But I didn't really start writing consciously until sixth grade when my sister died. So tomorrow is the anniversary of her death, to be honest. And she died in 1984. And it was a sudden thing, a sudden event. And she was 20 years old and I was 11. So I just remember I would I would accompany my mom for the funeral preparations and all those things. I would write on receipts, and I wrote little notes to my sister, and I stuffed them in her coffin, thinking they would go with her wherever she went. And after that, that was just a floodgate of poems, and I wrote a novel about a girl whose father died as a way of getting at the grief more obliquely, and kind of remaking the family I wished I had. I didn't want my father to die, but I didn't want to be so obvious to have the sister die. So I gave the character like 4 sisters. And anyway, I kind of started to have a reputation in my school as that, the writer. And so friends would say, my boyfriend broke up with me. Can you write us a poem, or can you write me a poem for that event? And I remember one kid tried to pay me $5 to do his poem homework assignment. And then in high school, like I mentioned, teachers would say, oh, you're really good at this. And so I would do it for fun. I would just write for fun. And I think my teachers also gave me assignments to keep me out of trouble, because I talked a lot in class. So I just was always writing and writing and writing. And then I write, and as an undergrad at Northern Iowa, I remember this very distinctly, this day where I decided I wasn't going to write anymore, because nobody was going to ever see the writing. So why was I wasting my time? And for some reason, I don't know what sparked it, I just decided I wasn't going to write anymore. And then something happened. There was some racist event, or somebody said a racist word, or somebody said something that made me angry. And so I just started writing and writing and writing. And I decided, it doesn't matter if no one ever sees this. I write to express myself, and to start to build up the vocabulary and the language to speak up, because I just didn't speak up a lot to other people when I was growing up. I was pretty, I did with my family, but I was really terrified of speaking up on things when I was at high school and college. So then I started to come out of my shell that way. And I think writing really helped me do that. So I still have the essay that was assigned in a class that says, I write so I can speak. I write so I can get that out, that first draft out. And I think that connects to now still. I never chose poetry. I think kind of poetry chose me indirectly, because I was writing, and writing for me still is like a writ large. Like I write memoir, I write other kinds of things too, but poetry, as an undergrad, I went to the University of Montana for a student exchange, and I tried to get into a fiction class, and I tried to get into a poetry class, and the fiction class was full. And so after taking that poetry class with Patty Ann Rogers, everything else melted away for the longest time, and I just focused on poetry. And what poetry has trained me to do, I think, is, as a writer, is really distill what I have to say down into very few words, with as strong of imagery as I can create, and sonics that pay a lot of attention to sound and sonics. And so that translates, I think, to other forms of writing pretty easily. But really, my focus of poetry has been able to hone those kinds of skills for me. And I think, it's hard to make the argument that you can only say certain things with poetry that you can't say in other genres, because as soon as I say that, I think of an example that contradicts that. But I do think that what poetry is one of the most ancient forms of art we have. We have painting, we have music, we have drawing, we have, music, and we have poetry. And there's something about its distilled nature that can, in rhythmic quality, that helps us transcend the mundane and get us to truth, or our truths, faster than many other forms of writing. So I think that's what the power that it has for me, and I think it has for many others, that kind of quality.
That's very interesting, in the sense that in the time when people have short attention spans, I would say that being able to say something succinctly in a memorable way would be quite an attribute.
Yes, and I think I'm not one to say that, poetry is dead. People are always trying to kill poetry, or people are saying, oh, it's not popular or whatever. And, if you look at sales, yeah, maybe that's true. I don't really care about that. What I do think is what makes poetry different from other forms of short writing is the layeredness that it can have. So, I mean, I think that I see tweets that are poetry, right? I see Facebook status updates that are poetry. I see lots of places where I say it's poetry or I think it's poetry and other people would disagree, or maybe the writer didn't intend it for it to be poetry, but I think it is. So, I see all the poetry a lot of places, because what it is it's a beautiful distilled way of saying something, but there's lots of layers there. Like, you can go back to it and unpack it and think about it and move it around in your head, and it changes the way you see something in the world. And that's what poetry is. So I see it in a lot more places than people say claim it. Like, I think people are writing small poems that don't even know they are.
And
So
as you say, they may not intend them to be
right.
poems, but they are. One of the interesting things as you speak of that, Christine, is that I've also heard people say, "Oh, people don't want to read poetry; it's a dead thing." But I think that kind of lapdog poetry might be dead. Where people just are just writing it for their patron or something like that. But then I remember when I got into poetry, one of the things uh, I kind of eased into it because it was a thing for boys just reaching around puberty to sit around on the steps and make up poetry on the fly. That
Mhm.
was a thing we did almost like as a hobby, you know. And it's interesting that many poems they morph into musical lyrics, and people say, oh, you like the lyrics, and you repeat the lyrics to the song, but you say poetry is dead, and you say, no, they just sold million copies of that poem, they just put music to it. No, you just have to have a form in which
Mhm.
people recognize it. Or I challenge people sometimes to take something like the lyrics from, let's say, James Brown,
Mhm.
or any, just pick a blues record and just say it instead of sing it.
Mhm.
Now,
Yeah.
and but the poetry is in the music as well.
Right.
And it's interesting that the earliest poetry that I've heard of, it was done to music,
Mhm.
or some
Mhm.
kind of drum. So it was like the original hip hop.
Mhm.
So
Right.
so I think that maybe we're coming full circle in
Mhm.
terms of and getting different ways to get music out. So with that soliloquy, I would just like to ask you, what kind of ways do you see uh, poetry, let's say, getting over the wall, escaping into the population? Or what kind of ways could there be that we can put poetry in front of people other than they buy a poetry book?
Well, I think it kind of starts with being more wide encompassing about what poetry is, and kind of problematizing or complicating those people's notions of what poetry is, just like you said, and just like we're doing now, like, oh, that's a poem, or that's, I think sometimes I'm s- I teach contemporary books of poetry to my students, and they're like, "Oh, I've never read a whole book of poetry before, or I've never read poems that like this before, or like that," because people just think poetry is was written 100 years ago, or 200 years ago, or 300 years ago. So they don't know what people are really writing now. So I think that people see more poetry than they really recognize as poetry, or they often see I don't know, kind of more, I don't want to say academic, but there's a lot, and I write some of it too. So there's a kind of poetry that um, that poets want to push the boundaries of the art. So they're really pushing far out, and they're really being experimental, and they're trying new things. And when just the ordinary reader sees that, who hasn't had much experience reading poetry, they're like, I'm not sure about that. I don't understand it. And they feel shut out from poetry. So I think that by trying to push the definitions of what poetry is, and in showing people poetry that is a little bit easier to access in a first read or a second read, and then building from there, then after a while that those readers can more appreciate those boundary pushing poets, right? But you need to get experience reading poetry before you start to appreciate that kind of poetry. And so I think a lot of times it's either this like more avant-garde poetry that people think about that they don't understand, or it's the older writing that people grew up with and they don't know what's happening in that middle ground. So
That's maybe like something like when people approach and first hear about art, the first artist they hear is Jackson Pollock, or they see is Jackson Pollock and they say, oh, I don't like art, when actually they're wearing art at the moment that they're saying that, but they don't realize that that's art too, or they drive art to work, or they live in art as their house. And I think it's kind of maybe opening up people's idea of what art is.
Yeah, I think that's, for me, it's hard for me to trace poetry with myself that way from the beginning, because I think my teachers, I learned so much poetry growing up before I really understood like what I was learning. And my mom would recite poetry. She, the nuns at her high school made them memorize a lot of poetry. And so she would, perform those poems when we were in the car and things like that. So I think I knew that I was learning poetry. But art, I can remember the moment of saying, I can remember the moment I was looking at a piece saying, oh, that's easy, anybody could do that. And then learning the context and learning the background and saying, oh, I understand why this is an important piece. And I understand, why Duchamp and the urinal piece, right? Why that was significant and why that's considered art. And so yeah, I think it's similar with poetry. It just needs to be broadened a little bit.
Yes. So now that you're poet laureate, congratulations again.
Thank you.
Can you talk to us a little bit about how you can use that position and that platform to bring art, to do some of those things you were just talking about, to bring art to people? How do you see that working?
Well, there are a lot of possibilities. My first project, my cornerstone project, is the anthology that just came out. We have the third launched version tonight, but it's the South Dakotan poems. And I envisioned this to be an anthology of poetry about South Dakota by South Dakotans or affiliated poets or people who'd lived here for a while but maybe moved away. And I envisioned doing this, and I decided to do this my first year as the poet laureate, because I wanted to use it as a tool then to have conversations for the next 3 years or so, like to when I go talk to a group or when I'm on Zoom with a group, just to showcase that book and say, like, this is what South Dakotans are writing right now. Here's what the poets are concerned about, and here's what's been going on in their and this is what they have to say about South Dakota too, about this place where we live. And I think I wanted to focus on South Dakota in themes, because I think that's another way to draw readers in. If it's just poetry by South Dakota writers, but could be about anything, that doesn't necessarily draw a reader in who doesn't know much about poetry. But if it's in a school or in a library, and I can say, oh, you're from Mobridge, like, here's this poem Sharon Schneerlarts wrote about Mobridge, or wrote about the river, and I'm willing to bet a lot of those readers can see themselves or the people they know in some poem in that book. So I think for me, that's one way to do it, is to try to put poems in the hands of of people who that there's a connection other than the genre of poetry. Like it's about something that they know. I think that ties back to my training as a teacher. You know, one of the things that I learned as a high school teacher, middle school teacher, was that you know what kids will read or what people will read is anything that you can put in their hands that they will read, right? So you can define like children's literature or young adult literature as anything those young adults will read. And one of the ways I learned to do that was to find out what they're interested in. You use the catalog and find them a book that is about that thing, you know, and get them to read that way. And that's what I'm doing with my own kids too now. So it just kind of translates over to poetry. So you don't read poetry, okay, but you know a lot about baseball. Well, why don't you read this poem about baseball and see what you think? And you have that way in, that expertise of the subject matter that you can bring to bear on the poem, and then learn about poetry that way. And that's what I was hoping to do with the anthology, and what I think it will do, to be honest, with the anthology, bring more readers to poetry. And for writers, then, you know, I'm really proud that a lot of the poems in the book are by people who've never gotten poems published before. And this is their first publication, a few of them. And then there are poets who've had many books published that are in the anthology, and they're alongside each other. And I think that that does a lot for the writers who haven't gotten a lot of poems published before. And there's just one small anecdote that was really moving to me, is that Melvin Thomas, who unfortunately passed away a few months ago, so he didn't get to see the book come out. But in his obituary, his widow wrote about the poem being accepted and coming out in the anthology. And this was a man who had a 40-year medical career, you know, amazing family, like so much to celebrate, and was so proud to have that poem in the anthology that it was mentioned in his obituary.
Yeah.
So like that's really meaningful to me, because I was like, that made a big difference for him and his family, to have that artistic, writerly part of him, you know, affirmed.
Yes.
Affirmed.
Yes.
Mhm.
You have talked a little bit about getting more people into writing poetry.
Mhm.
Have you given any thought or done any exercises on how to get poetry into people's hand? As an example, one of the ways we don't think about poetry often are greeting cards. And that's a big poetry, you know, I don't know, just not even a genre in poetry. It's a good big distribution mechanism for poetry. But there could be other ways too. And I'm just wondering if you could like talk about some ways that are either not utilized or underutilized that could possibly be expanded.
Well, I mean, it's a bit hard to, I mean, there's a lot of ways that people do public poetry or public projects with poetry. Like they put poetry on sidewalks in cement, or they'll put a mural with a poem on it, or they'll do, like in bigger cities and subways, they'll put poems on, you know, the subway window, or not windows, but the upper
Platforms.
parts, yeah, platforms. And just there's a lot of different ways that I've seen poetry just kind of jump out, you know, in different places. And I think that's great. And I don't know about it's I mean, there's always, when you're like talking about like greeting cards and things like that, there's a shift in audience and purpose that can sometimes happen, right? Where when you're starting to write for particular purposes, then it influences the way that you make decisions in the poem. So like, let's say people are just deciding to slip poems into greeting cards or something like that. That's interesting to me. But when I think about the audience for a greeting, like I write a lot about loss, for example, and I write a lot about grief. But if I was thinking about the poem ending up in a greeting card about grief, it would shift the way that the audience would be so expansive that I'm not sure I could say something to soothe everyone's grief, even because when I write that poem about grief, it's for a different purpose. Does that make sense? So I think that if people want to start stuffing poems in more places, I know that the Associate Poet Laureate of North Dakota, Bonnie Larson Steger, she had a project last year where she was putting poetry journals and poetry books and extra journals that she had into like offices, right? She was going and just donating all of this work to offices and waiting rooms. And I love that idea because I have a ton of journals that would love to get rid of that way because they're just stacking up in my office. But that would be another way to get poetry out. I think people just have to be creative and the ways that we do that, because like that takes time but not a lot of money. There's other projects that take a lot of money or you have to get grants for. I mean, there's just a lot of complications, I think, to do that.
Okay, so one of the areas that we often think that people aren't involved in poetry is young people, and that seems to be the default. If something, we feel something isn't going, we say, oh, let's give it to the young people and then we can die, you know. But I'd just like to talk about any efforts that you feel could, should, or are being made to expose more young people. Because I think, in some ways, I think young people are more involved in poetry than older people. But shifting to them for a moment, what kind of ways do you see that young people could be, in greater numbers, be introduced to poetry, either to write it or to appreciate it?
Well, I'm keying on your phrase, introduced to, because I think that the ways that poetry is introduced mostly to children is through children's books, right? I mean, it's almost all poetry. Some of it not well done, but but some of it really well done. Some of it really beautiful and really fun and musical. And I think that, you know, most of the kids that I know in the earlier grades and teachers of earlier grades really love to read poems to students in their books, their storybooks and things like that. But there's something that happens once poetry starts to be taught as literature, if you will. I think then in maybe like middle school, I think some teachers are, and I've talked to teachers because I sometimes I present at the like South Dakota Council of Teachers of English and things like that, and we talk about this. And I think that at some level, teachers are really hesitant to teach poetry writing, right? And they might, because it shifts to then literature, and if their focus becomes teaching the history of literature, so Edgar Allan Poe or the you know, like the great canonical writers, and then, but that's not what students want to write about, you know, like that's not what they want to read necessarily. And so it becomes, there kind of, I know several South Dakota teachers who are amazing at, you know, teaching writing, teaching poetry, and getting students to write in a really contemporary voice and making their voices open and assigning poetry. But they tell me they have to like squeeze it in because of they have a hard time seeing how it fits into the Common Core. So then poetry becomes like this extra thing, right? This other way, and so that becomes kind of shunted off. Or I see, and this what breaks my heart the most, when teacher says, well, I'll have my honors kids do the poetry unit. I just want to die inside a little bit, because I mean, like, it's not the honors kids it's every kid that can benefit from writing poetry. I mean, I had my own son who he was like a third grade reading level, has special needs. He wrote a haiku, and it took some like work because we had to take pictures of things, and then I had to have him describe what was in the pictures, and then we had to count syllables with our hands. But he wrote that haiku. He's super proud um, of it. And so I just, poetry can be for everyone. I think part of it is then I try to get with teachers and say, you don't have to teach a sonnet. You don't have to teach them to write a sonnet. You don't have to teach them the rules of poetry. There's ways of writing of poetry that is free verse, that focuses on visual imagery and rhythms that aren't attached to iambic pentameter. I mean, you know, I don't even know if I get that kind of like, the dactyls and anapaests. I mean, I can scan them and I might use them in a poem, but that's not what's exciting to me about writing poetry and reading poetry. So why would it be exciting to people who aren't focused on poetry like me? So I try to persuade one teacher at a time to open up, think about it for everyone. Poetry is really easy to sneak in there because it's not long. So you can sneak in a little poem every day to read, and then, sneak in a little assignment, in the margins. Poetry is easy to sneak into the margins. You don't even have to have a whole unit on it. It's easier to build across time and sneaking it in. So that's what I try to argue, is that then I think students will be more apt to write it on their own, see that they have talent to be affirmed by teachers. Like I said, for me, it was teachers who affirmed my early jaunts into writing poetry. And so yeah, I think that's a way to do it, just to and I try, teaching at the university to get future teachers to think about teaching poetry in different ways. But they don't have to take a lot of writing classes at all to be as English majors in the teaching track. So I don't always see them.
Well, it's interesting that you should say that, because a few weeks ago I was actually teaching a poetry to some grammar school kids, and one of the things I did is actually have them even to come up with new words, to even make up new words, but they had to make sure that they had a definition for them, not just make up a sound.
Right.
And then have them to experiment with things, and they just got such a kick out of that, and wrote some surprisingly good poetry. And I agree with what you're saying about, look, especially when in the early years, they don't get the whole grammatical structure, as for example, as in diagramming. That's like, what, but, and you can like actually turn kids off to education by making things just seem so restricted and boxed up, and no room, and they're not getting it, and they can feel like a failure or they're stupid, but it really is just the way that they're being taught.
Well, I love constraints of form. I write in form a lot, but it took me years to get there, and thinking about being immersed in my discipline before I got there. And I just definitely think that, that's not how that's not how it has to happen. I mean, one of the things that I remember learning from my kindergarten teacher, she taught a unit on poetry and science, because the number one thing for both things is observation and the power to observe. And so the kids went out and they observed things, and then they talked about they wrote a poem based on their observations. They wrote a poem, and then they talked about like what facts they can gain from their observations, or like just that introduction to that scientific way of thinking. And I was like, yeah, that's exactly it. I mean, there's more connections between different ways of thinking and experiencing the world and perceiving its perception, right? So I like that. I still, and in my writing, my best friend and writing partner Rochelle in Georgia. She teaches a class called neologisms, where she has her students making up words, and then she tries to get them, they try to introduce them to their groups of friends and family to get them to use those words. And so that's a great, and I'm going to steal that idea because it's just fabulous.
Mhm.
So you can do that with grammar school kids, and you can do that with college. Everybody loves to play with language that way.
And it gives people a buy-in. It doesn't sound like like you have to like first get your PhD and then we'll let you write a poem. It's like, well, okay, if you don't have anything to say, then that's the problem. It's not poetry, it's not grammar. You just don't have anything to say. So go out and observe something, go out and experience something, go out and have a life. Now that will prompt you to want to say something, I believe. Right. And
Yep.
if it does prompt you to say something, put that thing down. You're going to edit it later, maybe your first time is okay. But are you getting it across? Are you translating the thing that really spurred you to put pen to paper or just memorize something? You're sharing that with people. Did they get the same thing that you're trying to share?
Right.
So that's one of the things I like about poetry too, is that you don't have to be an expert to begin. Not that that's true at anything, but you can just go on and do it. And then if you like it, it's good, and then if you don't like it, improve it. If it communicates, because it's good for you. In other words, you may never show that to anybody, but if that thing is meaningful to you, great. If you're going to share it, then the other people you have to have maybe some kind of structure so that they can get what you're talking about. You're on the same page. Your Rosetta Stone, So, but other than that, if you communicate, the rest is academic.
Yeah, it's true. It's very true. Very true. Yeah.
Well, I want to encourage our participants, our fellow participants here, I want to invite them into this conversation. If they have questions, and while others are asking their questions, I would invite everyone else to start thinking of the questions that you might want to ask about poetry, or about poetry being used in the state, about being a poet laureate, all of those kinds of things. So anybody have a question that they want to ask?
Okay, I have a question.
Okay. Go ahead.
Don't push me, cause I'm close to the edge. I'm just about to lose my head. It's like a jungle sometimes. It makes me wonder how I keep on going under. So now, what would that be considered? You're talking about song and so on and so forth. And the young people that were doing things such as that, and other things to express where they were coming from, and there was no thesaurus that was necessary, everybody understood. What kind of an understanding does everyone need to have to get where people are coming from like that? And and I'm also familiar with the snapping of the fingers in the clubs, although I've never been there, because I didn't hang out in them joints. But wonder where that all comes in.
Well, I think it's all part of this like wider conversation of what poetry is and what informs. So I think when I think of like the edges of music and rap and spoken word, and that performance of the work coming in, it's a borderland, right? They overlap, and so the words are important, but the music is equally important or more important, and the way it's performed becomes the kind of the vehicle for people to remember it and experience it as a community. And so I think that that's one of the things that I love about hip hop and rap and spoken word, is that there's more of an emphasis on the communal experience of those forms. So other types of poetry is a really individual, can be a really individual experience as a reader. You read, you write something, you send it out in the world, someone reads it, but there's not like not always a shared experience with a group or something like that. So I think it's really important, and it's definitely part of it. One of the things that I was interested in, when I'm not an expert in this at all, but I remember watching a documentary on rap and hip hop, and I do teach little bits of it in my advanced forms class of my poetry class, but I remember them tracing like the sampling from like where sampling comes from, and how it with hip hop, and how like one group with rap would hear it, one group on the street performing on the street would hear it, and then they took it and they innovated it and used it and then made money off of it, right? I think it was one of the earlier rap songs that was really popular. I can't remember the beginning of it, but then they used that to kind of trace like this way of sampling the words and the phrases and the beats and the rhythms. And I found that like the intertextuality really amazing and exciting to see how that communal aspect was shared. And I think we sometimes see that with poetry, people, like I'll take a poem, a line from someone, and write a poem based on it, but it's not the same, because you can't hear the sample or the rhythms too. Like there's something very visceral about that I think it adds a lot to it. So I'm not sure if I answer your question right well, but
yes, that's good. I was wondering about the rhythmic.
Mm-hmm.
I just made up a word, the rhythmic whatever to
Yeah.
poetry. That's what I was wondering about. Thank you very much. You are so exciting, and so you're just like woo. I like that.
Thanks. I like getting good questions.
Anyone else has questions for Christine?
I have
Yes,
something I want to share. Well, I always have a lot to share. By the way, Christine, I lived in Des Moines 50 years.
Oh, good.
And I would like to know what schools you were in.
Well, I grew up just 2 blocks of Merle Hay Mall in Urbandale. So I went to St. Pius X and Dowling High School.
I taught at St. Pius and taught at Urbandale for many years.
So yeah, that's
I just had to throw that out. I'm sorry.
That's awesome. Oh man, that's amazing.
I am in a book group, and we just read Christina Baker's book, A Piece of the World. And she's writing about, the artists that from New England. Are you aware of Andrew Wyeth's painting?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Of the girl on the grass toward the house. Okay. One of the questions in our book group, and these are people that are avid readers and very good, one of the questions to discuss was, why did Emily Dickinson use poetry in her book? There was no response. And that question I thought was the most insightful question that was asked, because as I was reading how Emily Dickinson used it in here, it's kind of like using art symbols, like you said, that overlapped, because you're talking about the artist who is showing feelings. But this poem, you said this girl, it's a story about what this girl, that's basically what the story is about, the girl that was lying there. And she was the model for all paintings.
So the novel. So the novel is about a character in a painting.
Yes.
Okay.
The girl in all of his paintings.
So that, and is it based on fact, but kind of imaginary?
Absolutely.
Yeah, so
Yes.
that's a great example of fictional ekphrasis, right? I
I
think,
just loved it.
yeah,
I just
where
thought it was so marvelous, those words from the poem, and how it really overlaps. And after I mentioned it to these people, and they said, I can imagine you noticed that. And
so
I
wait,
thought, yeah, go ahead.
so the novelist uses Emily Dickinson's poetry in the novel too?
Yes,
Okay.
she gave examples of the girl
Oh,
who, because she was crippled,
okay.
and how she was treated, and it so identified her feelings, and I can understand those feelings, and I connected with those type of feelings. And so what I'm trying to say, what you're doing in your interconnection has been, there's so many different ways to do it, but this was amazing that this was done in this manner.
Yeah, I'm gonna have to get a hold of that book because I'm intrigued now. I need to read it.
Hey, this is my book. If you want it, just I will give you my phone number and I'll get it to you. How's that? You want to
Okay,
do that? Okay, thank you.
sure. That's awesome.
Yeah. Anyone else? Questions?
So I was going to ask, I mean, Christine, I feel like you're just open to all kinds of things as poetry, but I wondered if you have any thoughts about, lately it seems like there's been a lot of chatter about poets like, oh, is it Rupi Kaur, and who became famous on Instagram for these short little poems that she printed there, and other people that are doing that kind of really short poetic work on Instagram. I mean, do you think that's inspiring any additional activity, poetry activity, or among young people? I assume that you would say, hey, great, whatever, whatever format works. I know some people are like, oh, Instagram's not poetry, but yeah,
No,
what are your
I
thoughts
would,
on that?
yeah, I'm not familiar with it because I don't really post on Instagram, but I would say that if it's getting poetry out there, if people are appreciating it, that's great. I think the more you become a reader of poetry, I think the more you ask of the poet's craft. And I think that I've seen some like social media poems where I'll have a student say or something like, oh, this is just like the best poem, and I'll be like, I don't think it's the best poem. It's fine that you think it's the greatest poem, and that's fine. But I would ask more of craft from a poem that's gonna stick with me, and so I have I have opinions about the kind of the quality that I'm aiming for, and that I am trying to teach my students or teach people, who are more invested in the writing and the reading after a while, if that makes sense. I mean, sometimes it feels like poems on social media are really ephemeral because they disappear. How do they stick? Do they stick in your mind? Do they stick in your heart? Do they stick somewhere? And like, where are they? That, I mean, I think I like print because I feel like it's real somewhere. I've gotten poems published in a few online literary journals that went defunct, and now I'm like, where happened to it? Like, where does it exist in the world? They don't even have it archives, it's just this really strange feeling, I guess. So yeah, I mean, I'm for like writing, getting it out there. And then once you start to read it and consume it and make it part of your life, then you might want to always be reaching for a different kind, and a different level, different craft, or different, yeah. So I'm not one to say, I mean, I remember I've seen people say, oh, that's a really bad poem, and I've said that, but I'm really careful who I say it around, because I remember when I heard that and I was a beginning writer, I was really sad because I was like, why are you being so judgmental? Everyone's got to start somewhere. So I always offer my students and people in workshops advice on how to improve their work, right? But that's not the same thing as saying that's really bad. There seems to be something really upsetting about that phrase.
You know, one of the things I do with the prison group and the young people is I ask their classmates to say, "What did you hear from that poem? What did you get?" And then ask that person, "Is that what you were trying to say?" With the judgment being, if you accomplish what you set out to do, it's successful.
Right.
If not, it needs more work. Because you didn't accomplish what you were trying to do.
Yeah.
So then I often say, well, before anyone else says anything, do you see anything that now that you've read it out loud to everybody, because the printing press and the stage is always the best editor. You say, now that you've said it, do you see anything that you would like to change? Do you see weak points in it? And especially when I have given them the opportunity to record their poem and videotape it. And then the next session we come back and we play that videotape and you say, how did you look? How did you sound? What did you think about that poem? And it's amazing how that, yeah, the critic really, an internal critic just says, I don't know. Maybe, and then ask other people, hey, could you offer him any suggestions on how he might improve that? Even without writing the poem for him, just say, well, what was lacking if it didn't, what was missing in that? And I think that's helpful for the person to grow.
Right. I learned in a workshop at the Nebraska Writing Project one time, I learned a phrase that I still use and it's called blessing and pressing. Can you bless the poem and can you press the poem, right? You say one thing that's really strong and press it, one thing that could make it move into a different territory. And I like that because it's easy, it rhymes. It's easy to remember. And there's nothing critical about that. Like, there's nothing like pressing something isn't, there's no emotional reaction. Like when I don't even like the word critique ever. Like I just banish that word from any interactions because critique, people just like, you can see their bodies, like they just constrict, and their eyes get really big and they get scared.
Blood pressure goes up.
Yeah.
Vasodilation ceases.
Yeah. So.
Yeah. Anyone else have any exchange for Christine? Well, while they're thinking.
Oh, Betty does.
Oh, Betty. Sorry.
Hi, thank you so much for this lovely day. I mainly want to thank Lee Raines for bringing Andrew Wyeth to the conversation. I'm right on the heels of that book. He's a great inspiration to me. And so I'm glad to hear about this book. And I might mention the word critique. I participate in particularly small group plein air experiences. And mostly the ones I'm going to speak of have been with my brother and his wife, because we love each other so much that we can stand the heat of pressing. So we do call it critiquing, but we make sure when we start, and if there are any newcomers, that they all understand that this is the means of honestly expressing what we see and what we think might be something to reconsider. But I love the blessing and pressing, because that we always start. You have to say something positive. So it's understandably very valuable in creative pursuits. So
yeah, I find that it's really hard to be honest when you don't have a relationship with the person. I mean, sometimes people think it should work opposite. Like you can be more critical if you don't know the person or if it's like anonymous. But to me, like I always tell my students, like if I didn't care about you and your work, then I wouldn't say what needs to improve about it. And it's based on our relationship. I mean, I'm way more with Rochelle, my friend I was talking about earlier, like we still make each other cry occasionally, and we've been working together for 15 years. Like she's looked at every single thing I've ever published, you know, first, or, you know, and but it's because we have that closeness that we can be honest with each other, and we can be we can tell each other too how we feel about a piece, and the kind of so like like if she says you know, this is a new draft and I'm excited about it, so just, you know, do more strengths, tell me what's strong about it. And then later on, when you get that emotional distance and she's like, all right, now say, you know, now I'm ready for it. So we can tell each other where we are emotionally with a piece of writing and kind of gauge each other's response to that. And I tell my students that too. They can write author's notes, you know, when they exchange drafts, to tell each other where they're at with a draft. And that's not what usually you're taught in like traditional workshops, right? It's supposed to be this like cone of silence that goes over the author, and you just give them the bare poem and everyone jumps on it, you know. But I have found that it's that's counterproductive. So thank you.
Yeah, I think a good relationship is founded on that kind of honesty. I mean, a really true, deep give and take relationship. And then if you're lucky enough to have a friend or a small group of people with whom you can lay that over whatever creativity you're expressing. That's what our art group does. We keep telling people who come, newcomers, this is a safe place for you to bring anything, bring nothing, talk about what you're thinking, and we're going to hear it and accept it. And if you want us to give suggestions, oh, we can really do that. But
Yeah.
done in that
Right.
framework. Okay, thank you so much.
Yeah, that's great. That's really great. Thank you.
Anyone else?
Lawrence?
Yes. I think you have two devices on, and they're looping and giving you feedback. Or at least turn the sound on one of them. Okay, try now, Barb. Barb? Well, I guess we lost Barb. I don't know. That's her mascot. Oh, there she is. She's back. You want to try again, Barb? There you go.
Lawrence?
Yes, we got you now. Can you hear me? Can you hear me, Barb? I'm not sure. Barb. Okay, well, we'll go forward, and I'm sure she'll get back with us later. I hope she'll get back with us later. Christine, can you talk a little bit about how poetry might help connect humans? You know, we call this kind of like brainstorming the human connection, and one of the focus issues is how do we amplify or even make better human connections? And can you talk about the potential for poetry to be part of that toolbox?
Sure. It's a really big question, but I think my answer, the start of the answer, comes through what I think the power that art has, and to act on our emotions and to be persuasive on our physical bodies. So what I mean by that is when you read a poem and it uses physical details and, you know, visual imagery and sound, it appeals to your five senses, smell, touch, taste, all of those things. Even you know, and so you write a poem that's laden with these sorts of images. And it's about, you know, like I'll just give an example, like about miscarriage, because I've written a lot about miscarriage. So let's say I have a poem about miscarriage and it has lots of images, maybe not gory images or gross images, but images to get to that sense of loss. And, you know, I give it to you, Lawrence, and I'm, you know, you've not had miscarriages, right?
Not really.
So you've not had those, but through those physical details and those sensual details that I'm describing in my poem, your body feels a sense of loss, because I've written from my experience so convincingly that you are moved to sense that loss too. You've not had the same experience as me, but you felt loss somehow in your life. And by reading my poem, my loss activates your emotional sense as a human being, and you feel that loss too, right? You understand that loss feeling, even though you don't understand my loss in particular. Does that make sense?
Yes, it does.
So I think that's where we can really get to this idea, because I see a lot of times we say, oh, you can't understand me because you are different, which is true. Like, I don't understand what it's like to be a man or what it's like to be Black, or what it's like to be transgender, or there's a lot of identities that I don't physically have physical experiences being, but I don't expect to like embody those experiences when I'm reading about them. But what I want to see is, I want to have that emotion. I do have emotional connections. Like I've experienced confusion, or I've experienced loss, or I've experienced terror. And maybe those are from different experiences in my life. But when I read someone else's terror from their experience, I can start to break down those differences, because we're relating on that emotional terror, right? We're relating as human beings who've experienced a similar emotion for different reasons. And I think that's what we can do. And so I think that's one of the reasons poetry is really important to connecting humans that way. Yeah.
Well, Barb had a kind of a follow-up connected question.
Okay.
And she points out that many people, especially people who are in lockdown, you know, whether it's in a long-term care facility or prison, or just sometimes even in a home, she asked, how can poetry be included into the lives of these people who have endured the lockdown and stuff like that? How might poetry be used to positively affect their lives?
Well, it would be, I mean, it would be great to be able to talk to the people who kind of curate their social lives in places where, you know, in like in a facility where it's like locked down, right? Because there's so much happening like this, like via Zoom, right? Like there's so many people performing poetry online and performing and reading, doing poetry readings, and there's ways that people can connect. I think what we don't have is the curators and facilitators of those connections happening very much. I mean, there's a ton of poems out there, poetry out there, but does it get into those places, like, right? So that idea before that Bonnie has in North Dakota about donating books or donating journals to these places, that those are some ways. I think right now it's all about trying to get people to connected and connected like through technology or through books or through other means to remind them that they're not alone. I mean, you know, I was talking to my this is recorded, so I'm gonna be really careful about what I say. But I was talking to my students about who are, you know, in their 20s, about plans for next semester and going home for the holidays and the rates in South Dakota with the COVID rates right now. And, you know, one of them pointed out, well, you know, you have a high risk child so that you can probably, you know, avoid a lot of danger because you can tell people that. And I was like, yeah, but I'm trying to think about everybody, not just my own personal interest, right? And when I think about making sacrifices, it's for those people that are isolated because of COVID, who are in those facilities, who are the most likely to be at high risk for you know, it's the 70s and 80-year-olds who are succumbing when they get COVID often. So I'm not just passionate about this for my children, for my family. Like, I'm thinking of all these other people that I just want to keep on this planet like a few more years. Like, you know, I hear my students, I don't think they see their grandparents, but they don't understand I don't think they get the value of all of us here on this planet and then this state now. Like, I'm sorry, I'm super passionate about it because I'm just tired of people looking at their own self-interest, you know, when I want everyone here because we have a vaccine on the horizon. So if we can all just be good for, you know, a couple more months or so, we will save lives and we won't have to make these sacrifices anymore. But it's amazing. You know, I said this when I have this poem about, when I had one of my miscarriages, I realized, like, I loved that being that I never met, only because that being was going to be mine. Like, that was my like flesh, right? That being was going to be mine, my child, had it not worked out. And I had this insight that day. I was like, what if we all could just like love other people for that we hadn't met, you know, because I loved that child, even though I hadn't met it. Right. And I don't know, that was really powerful for me. So I don't know, like, that question makes me think a lot about how we show our love to people we've not met through our own choices and own small choices or big choices. But yeah, so that goes off on a different direction, but that's what I've been thinking a lot about in terms of COVID. It's just wanting people to know that there are people out there thinking of them and making choices in their lives that don't know them.
And I think that brings actually the point that poetry can help us make connections between each other so that we're able to have empathy. You know, we can feel that human connection, because many people, one of the reasons they have trouble with empathy is because they don't know anybody. They have, and when I say no, I mean like have enough of a connection that they feel that person is them. You know, they can feel themselves, that the mirror neuron turns on to the point that people can feel like what happens to you is happening to me. You know, when I see the quarterback get sacked and I go, ooh, that didn't happen to me, but I have empathy with the quarterback, especially if I like that quarterback, you know, even though I haven't met that quarterback and he doesn't know exists, you know. So I think that it's that the kind of thing you're saying, you know, connects directly to what Barb was asking, in the sense of getting poetry to help us see through the eyes, feel through the experiences, hear through the ears of others.
May I make a suggestion, Barb? I love that you love everybody. You're just such a loving person. I love you. one of the things that we've done before is we have some of those journals that we pass around. And you guys, if people are in what's considered a family group, then it could be passed around with safety or gloves, or I don't know how you do it, but, or just get a great big board and everybody write something, and then somebody be able to respond to that, whether it's a book or on a board or whatever. And then people will start to see that they're not in that same, they're in that same boat, like, oh, I couldn't get my hair done. Oh, I couldn't get my hair done either. And then somebody says, and now I have dandruff. Somebody might give somebody a way to get rid of the dandruff, so to say. But then there can be that interconnection. And it can go on for days and days and days and days. And I hope that might be something you could do, Barb, because that might work. It really might work. We kind of do that online sometimes. And it does work.
And I can really attest to the misery of not having your hair done. One question that came up, Christine, is: do you have any advice for people who want to start off writing poetry, aspiring poets, and they don't know where to begin? Any advice for them?
Yeah, I think starting small, and so there's lots of ways you could go about it. So you could do timed writing every day. So let's say 15 minutes a day, I'm going to sit down and I'm just going to kind of dump out everything in my head. And that's Julia Cameron's The Artist Way. It's a pretty classic book now, but she talks about morning pages and just waking up and writing down things that are happening and kind of clearing out your head. And then that could become a way to find topics to write about. I'm assuming that the question is like, someone might not know what to say, know what they want to say. They don't know what to discover, how to discover what they want to say. So I think that's a good way. Another way is along those lines are prompts, like writing prompts. And there are lots of books that you can have that have prompts, but you can also just Google them, like creative writing prompts or poetry prompts, and find a million prompts online. And one of my friends, prints them out and cuts them and puts them in a big fish bowl, and will draw out a prompt every time and write from that prompt. And then for me, the poems never come out in lines, the first draft. For me, the poems come out in these like lists or prosy bits or chunks or paragraphs, right? They don't have to be poems originally. I think there's too much pressure I put on myself if I think, okay, I'm writing a poem, it has to be in this line or this form or whatever. So I just try to sit down and write. I remember when I really got serious about my writing practice, I started copying words from the dictionary. So that's also a good way to get to just like immerse yourself into like literal language. And just start copying words and the cool definitions that they come with, and like words that surprised you and words that were interesting, and then maybe trying to use that in a poem. And then when you get some material, then the next kind of step, if you will, is, although that material gathering never stops, right? You're always gathering material, is to start shaping it into a poem. And there's lots of books on that, on poems and how to shape lines, but I really suggest looking at examples of what makes a line in free verse is kind of, you can use like your breath to end the line. You can have a sentence that goes across one line and onto the next line. So sometimes there might be a 20-line poem, there's like one sentence in the poem, the sentence just keeps moving down. So in poetry, we have two things. We talk about a line and a sentence, right? There's some tension between them. So why not just end the line on the sentence? Well, then every line gets one sentence, it gets really choppy. So you might break the sentence up and start a new line where there's an important word, and a word you want to emphasize, or a word or that maybe you take a breath, and so then the poem moves to the next line. So there's a lot of different theories. I call them logistics. Or logics. There's a lot of different ways to kind of think about that, but there's no wrong way if you've thought about it. That's what I tell my students too. I'm like, if it's a deliberate decision, then it's okay. If it's not a deliberate decision, if you just like willy-nilly'd it and you don't have a reason for it, then think about it, see if that's the best way. So that's where I start. And reading contemporary poems, there's so many great like Poetry Daily, Verse Daily, American Life and Poetry.org, where you can find poems. They can be sent to your inbox. I have one of my favorite apps for my phone is the poetry. I just touched it. Now it's uploading. No. I was going to show it to you. It's from the Poetry Foundation, and it's really great because you spin it. And it will put two things together, like poems on passion and youth, and it will list them all that you can like listen to or read, and then you can change it. So here's passion and aging, right? You can make different combinations, and they'll give you different poems, like passion and nature, right? So there's these nostalgia and commitment, right? And then there's different poems. So there's lots of free ways you can get poems, but reading poems are also a great way to start, because they give you inspiration. You can kind of study the way those lines look in order to shape your own poem. Yeah.
One of the things that, one of the ways I approach that is I get from working with clay, and that is that you take a lump of clay, and the first thing you have to do is get the air bubbles out, so you make sure it's not going to explode in the kiln. But once you beat that down until it's like one ball of clay, that's your substance of the thing, or the thing you're going to write about. Then after that, you start to form it, but before all of that, you have a vision of what you want the thing to look like in the end, because that determines what size of clay and all of that. So it's kind of like start with something and work on it, and don't think that you have to have the finished poem all out in one, string of spaghetti. It doesn't not that way. It's like more like macaroni. You put it lots of little pieces you put together and stick together with cheese. So it's more like that. So that way it's not so intimidating, and just edit. That's your friend. Some people feel like, well, editing is like, like that's not really the thing, but it is the thing. Like it's rare that a poem comes out all in one, it's like a baby being born with teeth and a beard. It doesn't happen often, So I would say work on it, just, and get one, I say the same thing to when I've taught English classes. If you don't have anything to say, there's no point in learning English, because you have nothing to say. It's a pointless exercise. So go do something, get involved, burn yourself, and see if that doesn't inspire a poem. Put your hand in the fire, so to speak, literally or figuratively. Go out and have an experience. Now you have something to say and think about, feel that experience. And to Christine's point, the dictionary is your friend. I like to keep a dictionary by my bed and try to learn a new word every night. Then it's not just a word that you learn, you learn a whole new experience, a whole bunch of new ideas and experiences that are encapsulated in that word. And then you'll find out that word means a whole bunch of things. Now that's where the poetry starts to happen, because you can see how you can have many meanings in that one word, So I would say the most important thing to do is start putting something down on paper, and then don't be afraid. The garbage can is also your friend. If it's not working out, just ball it up and it costs you a piece of paper. you know, and these days just put it on the computer.
Yeah, I think I mean, for me, I started with really I mean, there's a definite shift for me between when I was like dabbled in poetry my whole life up until I started my PhD program. And then I was like, okay, I'm going to do this for real now. So I better be writing 10 hours a week. You know, I mean, like I better be making a practice doing it every single day. And so when I started there, I had really low expectations. It was just to sit in the chair for 2 hours. Like that was my expectation. I wrote nothing for like the first 2 days. And then that's when I got the dictionary idea. So I was like, okay, I'm gonna just, you know, start copying words. And then, okay, I had some stuff written after that. And then it built from there. I think people expect too much, right? They expect to sit down for however much time and have something, like you said, a finished product emerge. And that's just never been my experience. And it's not the experience of most writers I know and that I've read about. So maybe somebody somewhere is like a little incubator, and every time they think of something, the perfect draft comes out, but I don't know them. So yeah, just lower your expectations and just practice.
Yeah. Anyone else have a question for Christine? We're about ready to wrap it up now, so if you have one.
I want to say thank you, all of you. Christine, Lawrence, and I'm telling you, this is the highlight of my week. And I don't have another question, but I'm sorry I didn't turn on I didn't want to scare you because I look like I've been in an accident and I haven't. But I'll do it quickly and then I'll say goodbye. But thank you very much.
Well, just for drill, I miss seeing your beautiful face when you don't turn it on.
And you have my phone number now, Christine.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, good. Well, that is just wonderful. Thank you so much, Christine, for joining us and sharing some poetic experiences with us. I'm hoping that others might be inspired to not only write some poetry, but also to inspire others to write poetry as a way of sharing even. You know, if you find a poetry friend, you know, so find somebody who might want to exchange poetry as Christine and Rochelle are doing. Just say, hey, look, you know, I want to write some poems. Would you write some poems with me, and we'll share the poems and just see what we think of each other.
Yep.
Not of each other, of the poems. We'll go there.
Do you all have a poetry group that you that you hook up with, and are you two in the same group or what?
Oh, we're on the board of South Dakota State Poetry Society Board of Directors. We're both on, yeah. And
there's a poetry group that's happening in Brookings, the Brookings area, and Craig Paul has been trying to get people to meet, and he was meeting outside for a while, and I think they've tried to transition to Zoom meetings now. Right. But you know, if anyone's interested in that, I think it kind of breaks down regionally or town by town or by city in South Dakota. So
but what if I want to be in your group?
In mine?
Yeah.
The group that I am in most I guess the poetry group that I'm in the most active with is the Women Poets Collective, and we are a group that responds to each other's book length manuscripts each year. So if you have like 24 to 50 poems that you want ready, for some feedback, one of the things that we're trying to do as a group is to figure out how to expand and just kind of take what we do as a model for other groups to follow. So one of the things I was hoping to do, and this kind of goes back to the beginning, but since I have the anthology out now, one of the things I was hoping to do once the COVID situation kind of gets better is to go throughout the state and try to teach a couple of us from that group, from the Women Poets Collective, to try to teach other groups, and not just women, but we use like a more of a feminist way of sharing the work and distributing things. And so like those kinds of values to teach other groups how to do that, what we're doing, because most of us who sent work out, I think 11 of the 12 of us have gotten books published based on our work together. And so I think it's a pretty successful model, but that's really the only group that I am a part of with my poetry.
And I have a group, I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, go ahead.
I have a poetry group that meets every Thursday night at 8 o'clock. So, you know, and you can go on our, if you're on Facebook, I usually put it on there, or often put it on the Facebook group, but it's the same URL. So every week. So that's a thing too, you can join, and we share poetry on that group as well.
Yeah, and becoming a member of the South Dakota State Poetry Society is also a good way to see what writing is happening and learn about other writers too. And our sdpoetry.org is our website, and it's a new website, so it's still in developing and getting bigger. But I know that we do a lot of things through that group too.
Yes. Any other parting thoughts?
Not from me.
Okay.
I
right.
think that was it. I think I wanted to remember to say something about the Poetry Society.
Yeah. Please do, like, check out our Facebook, or you can email me, or then you know, I'm going to put my email in the chat, and then you can then you'll have it.
Well, that's cool, because I thought I was going to be bored. I'm not.
Yay!
So
Success.
there's my email address. If you're interested, email me and I will send you a link to our poetry group, and you can come in and listen to what other poems people are writing, and of course bring your own. And then you can, that's a safe place to share your poetry. Very few people leave with a bloody nose or ears bleeding or anything like that. Very few. That's a good place to start. Well, with that, we're going to end our interesting discussion. I'd like to thank you, Christine, for joining us and adding to our discussion. And we'll see all of you next week, same time, same station.
Bye-bye.
Bye.